Coming to you from the Windy City. Welcome to Let's Talk Shop, a podcast about all things cloud and enterprise tech. Listen to insights and guest interviews with IT thought leaders and professionals. Now, here's your host, Elias Khnaser.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Let's Talk Shop. Today, we are going to have a follow-up conversation on the one that we had with Steve Madden, who is the VP of Segment Marketing and Digital Transformation at Equinix. Today, we are going to do something a little more interesting, a little different. Not that Steve's session wasn't interesting, but we're going to do something interesting. The GXI report is packed with information. It's a lot of data. If you haven't browsed through it yet, if you haven't downloaded a copy, I'll make sure to keep a link down below. But it's a lot of information. And today I've invited my friend who's also at Equinix, Jed Bleess, who's the Director of Segment Marketing at Equinix, to help us go through all of this data, make sense of it. How do I use it? How do I read it? How do I understand it? Jed, I can't tell you how great it is to have you on the show.
Elias, it's been so great to work with you, and thank you for bringing us on today.
Absolutely. So GXI is fresh off the press, right?
Yes.
We just released. So tell me a little bit about GXI. Why the heck are we even tracking interconnection? Who tracks interconnection data?
That's a great question. We've been doing this for 6 years. This is actually our 6th volume, but that's probably the number one question, which is why are you bothering to do this? Well, it's kind of interesting. This goes all the way back to 2017, and our premise was the growth of the digital economy was going to require the movement of vast amounts of data. And in order to be able to move that much data efficiently, organizations, whether they're providers or enterprises, are going to need a fundamental tool to be able to do that. And peering is how all of these organizations are growing. This is what led to the growth of the internet. This is what has led to the growth of the web ecosystems, the cloud ecosystems, electronic trading. And this is what's driving the growth of the digital ecosystems and economy. And so by tracking interconnection, we're getting direct insight into how fast, where, and with whom the digital economy is growing and at what rate. And every year we try to expand that. And this year we've brought in our greatest insights to really hone in on how is your ecosystem, now your infrastructure. So this is a great volume to look at.
That's super cool. So again, there's a lot of data that's packed into this thing. So I'm hoping you can help us understand the data. If I'm a customer, how do I understand the data? If I'm a provider, how do I understand the data? Where is these interconnections happening? Is it just in North America, just in the US? Is it worldwide? Can you show me?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, where, who is interconnecting and where? And I think let's just start with a little bit of a map overall. What we're looking at is the growth of interconnections across all regions, across all metros. And our analysis goes beyond even Equinix. What we're looking at is what is the entire market doing? So we're analyzing over 38 metros. And in fact, some of these are metros that Equinix doesn't have a presence in because we're looking at the forecast of all of these locations and bringing that data together. We start off with some of the locations that many organizations are pretty familiar with because they're trying to become cloud adjacent in these locations. So whether you're trying to take your largest IaaS providers and you're trying to move infrastructure right next to them to get the best hybrid performance for multi-cloud solutions, you're likely going to be in one of these locations already. Not only are you, but all of your peers, all of the other organizations in your ecosystems and the providers are also growing in those locations. So these digital core locations are where organizations are really building their foundation and becoming cloud adjacent to scale their presence. So you'll see that as the first cut of locations. But what we found is while these have the greatest bandwidth, the digital edge is where it's the fastest growing. So we've added in all of the locations that we see organizations aggregating infrastructure to get closer to areas where they're delivering services, driving new experiences, grabbing onto more data, and analyzing it closer to where it's produced. So in all of these edge locations, this is where organizations are trying to distribute infrastructure to get closer to those resources. So we've combined all that together into one view in this year's index.
That looks awesome. Anything that stands out, like any geographies that are maybe growing faster than others? Anything that stood out at you? And by the way, I really like that this is, some of this data is not just Equinix specific. It really makes it industry wide, so folks can benefit from this and really get a high level view. But does anything stand out? Any particular market
Well,
performing
so I
better than
think
the other?
what stood out the most for me personally is that there were some patterns of growth where we saw that the Americas had the greatest amount of bandwidth, while Asia Pacific was one of the fastest growing. That wasn't really a surprise. We've seen those
Right.
trends. But what I'm showing you right here is the unique mix of interconnection that we're seeing in every one of these major locations, and the different profiles and the range of use cases this is being used for. So if you narrow in here and you look at, let's say, New York and London, you can see how on those, that red portion is so much larger than the others. And that represents financial services, because that is the dominant use case that's happening in these hubs where we see banking, electronic trading, and really dominating the market. Now, if you look at some of the other locations, take next to London, Amsterdam, or come over to Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley. Those locations, you see how we have a much more even mix between the black area, enterprise, how much connection is being driven by the cloud providers and the hyperscalers, that blue and green, versus the network. So that's a much more balanced, what I would look at as a cloud adjacent use case. But then we still have other profiles. Come down to Sao Paulo and Sydney. There, you're going to see some really interesting patterns. You're going to see how much larger the percent of interconnection is being driven by the enterprises as they do peering directly with other providers, as they're requesting more bandwidth out. And you can see it's really much of an enterprise partnership-led and ecosystem-led areas. And so my surprise for me was how the single tool interconnection was being used globally across so many industries, so many use cases, and driving fundamentally different profiles, but all have one thing in common. They need the movement of vast quantities of data. And so we see how it's being altered and tailored in each one of the locations.
Does the data show, for example, that there's some saturation that's happened already, for example, in the US, where in other areas, these interconnections between the enterprises and different providers is growing at a faster rate?
Well, that's a great question. So to answer that, let's look into the actual data of what we can see. Let's start globally. Okay, so let's start and look at the global forecast. And what we've brought in are a set of charts to help you understand where is bandwidth growing, at what rate, and over a window from 2021 to 2025. So let's break these charts down a little bit, because I want to really answer your question. We're going to have to look at what is the data that we have available and how can you look through this. So I'm going to break these down and just sort of step you through this. So in the first area, when we look at any of these charts, what we're able to start with is what's our baseline? What have we identified as the bandwidth that's available in 2021? And then for each year after that, how much incremental bandwidth is being added in 2022, up through 2023, 24, and then 25. And this is giving you a pretty good visual of how much bandwidth you're starting with and what's the rate of acceleration and growth. And you can see globally how we're continuing to accelerate at a 40% CAGR, so that in 2025, we're adding nearly as much bandwidth as we already had back in 2021. The other thing that we're able to look at is the mix. How is our split between how much of this is being driven by service providers versus enterprises? Now, at the moment, you're going to see the majority of the bandwidth is being driven by service providers. That's not a surprise. Peering as a tool, it was been driven by all the network providers and cloud providers. So that's not a surprise. But what is happening is we see the enterprises really starting to grow and accelerate and outpace. And so that's where we can start to look in our data, not just across regions, but now get into different industries. So here you'll see a snapshot of that same data. Where are you starting in 2021? How much are you growing? And you can see how much faster these enterprises are growing. I mean, look at the incredible amount of bandwidth that's being added by banking and insurance in 2025. That's more than what they had in 2020 plus 2021. So the enterprises are going through this huge hockey stick acceleration. Now, the service providers, on the other hand, they've just come out of a major surge. The service providers had to transform their network operations in order to support the work from home models. They came out of COVID. They had to replace all of that headroom and bandwidth. And so 2021, we're already starting with this huge surge that already happened. Now, after that, they're continuing to grow. But many of the service providers, their challenge is that next bottleneck. How are they going to solve the last mile? How are they going to solve for that final 5G access? So we can see in the data how the service providers have already created that huge surge in bandwidth in 2021. And now incrementally, we're growing out at a 36% CAGR rate. But it's the enterprises where we see the really surprise growth that's happening. And this is true globally. And if we were to break it down to each one of the regions, you're going to see the same patterns.
That's fascinating. So what you're saying is because of the pandemic, service providers had to ramp up. So their investments in increased interconnection bandwidth has already happened and is continuing to grow. But we're seeing kind of the enterprises now take the lead for the next couple of years in terms of interconnection bandwidth. They're going to outpace the service providers, correct?
That's correct. And if you look at the amount of bandwidth, let's take telecommunications. In 2025, our data is showing they're adding just under 2,000 terabits per second of bandwidth and capacity in 2025, based on our forecast. Coming back to the enterprise, banking and insurance is adding nearly as much bandwidth in 2025 as our network providers. Okay, that's incredible. We have a single industry that is adding as much interconnection bandwidth, that is showing you how much data these organizations are having to move, and they're using the same tools that back in the day was really reserved just for the service providers. It is now necessary for the growth that's happening. And so this is where the hockey stick is. A couple years ago, the enterprises coming out of COVID, they really needed help. And the service providers stepped up and they were really helping all the organizations. But now these enterprises are shifting. They're becoming digital providers. And you can see the growth and the adoption of bandwidth. And that's what's beautiful about the data in the index, is it doesn't just show you what industries. It can help get you into what regions, what locations, what metros, where is this happening the fastest.
So you mentioned banking and insurance a few times. What would be like the next industry that is like number 2 in terms of consumption?
Well, let's look at our top 4. So we have banking, insurance, and securities and trading. And these linked to banking, financial services, electronic trading. That's not a huge surprise. This is one of the very early use cases for direct interconnection because of the performance necessary for many of their industries. But our next set, let's look at those next 3: manufacturing, energy and utility, and wholesale and retail trade. The consumer requirement to be able to drive improved experiences is driving wholesale. The demands on energy to transform and the demands to partner across all organizations have been fundamentally changing how energy and utilities connecting, and they're becoming my number 4 consumer of interconnection bandwidth out of my industries. And then of manufacturing, taking the oldest, one of my oldest industries that has started the revolution, and then coming around to look at the amount of bandwidth as they really transform in how they're using technology, how they're transforming that operational floor, how they're driving new levels of automation, and really driving new intelligence. But all that requires that movement of data, and we can see their bandwidth being consumed there.
So, Jed, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but real quick. So if I'm a service provider, if I'm a vendor, a partner, a provider, whatever the case is, the way I should be interpreting or looking at this data is I'm looking at these centers where there's growth and interconnection, and I want to go and introduce services where that growth is if I don't have services. Am I correct there? And then if I'm an enterprise, I'm looking at these growth patterns and saying, we are likely to have, especially if we're a global enterprise, we are likely to have a footprint in some of these metros. So how do I prepare? Am I analyzing this correctly?
Well, you are. Now, one of the things to realize is, because you kind of get a mixed scale here, keep in mind, all of the compound growth rates we're showing here are incredibly fast. So none of these are on the low end. But you're able to see where we have some of those real spikes. We can see the demands on public sector here. So I think a lot of the technology partners and providers, they really have to look at the growth and anticipate the demand of services that are going to be around the public sector, because we can see that growth that's really predicted there. While energy and utility and manufacturing, they are fully consuming digital services at scale. And how are we going to serve that? So part of what you're seeing here is a maturity curve where you can look at where are they at in the building the foundation, integrating services or delivering services, and how quickly are they growing. So you can not only look at where to focus, but using the data a bit to really understand where should you be in that phase, helping public sector and industrial services really build that foundation while helping manufacturing and energy and utility really get to the next tier, because you can see with the amount of bandwidth they're using, they're ready for that next stage. So I would look at those 2 different angles.
Fascinating.
And the next stage in that analysis is not just to look at where are we at on overall consumption, but let's come all the way down in our data, and now let's look at where can we actually see the growth coming down to a metro level. So all of the data I showed you in those charts, in the index, we have that broken out across all of the verticals, across all service provider and enterprise, and really breaking down into core and edge locations. We have 38 metros that we've brought into our analysis to highlight. Plus, we've summarized many of the others that didn't make the cut for being a key highlight. And just as you start to go through all the regions and all the data, you can take that data and just visualize it in different ways. Here, I've taken the data of all the different metros, and I've really compared it based on my 2025 forecast. Where is the growth going to be? Which has the greatest amount of bandwidth? And how do these compare? And you can see just off of this chart how Americas has the greatest total amount of bandwidth. And you can start to look at what are those top metros. And across every one of the regions, you'll see that the top 4 to 5 metros, those really are the core locations where we have the greatest amount of cloud-adjacent, ecosystem-driven connections that are happening in those areas. Now, the same overall model, I can take that model and I can sort of flip the analysis. And I can look at, well, let me analyze it now and let me compare what's the growth rate. Let me visualize this based on growth rate. Now here, I can take the same number of metros, and now I'm looking at what are the fastest moving metros. And all of these are those edge locations. And this is what really helped us come to that realization that the edge is where that acceleration is happening. In fact, these edge locations are outpacing growth in the core by speed by about 20%. And we see that's where so much of the growth is happening as organizations are not just trying to get their operations established for the digital presence, but how are they going to deliver that at the edge? And how are they going to optimize for either intelligence or new experiences at those edge locations? So there's a lot of data here, Elias, and I hope a lot of your viewers and a lot of those organizations you work with are able to leverage and use that for a variety of purposes.
I'm gonna stop us for a second. Is this the last slide? You want me to end it here?
No, I was going to go to the then I was going to go down to the metros.
Okay, so let me then ask you about the metros. So
Okay.
let's stay on this slide for a second. That's interesting, man. It's super interesting. And GXI is free, right? Am I correct? You guys give this report away with all of this information?
Absolutely. So GXI is a free download. I mean, you're able to take that and consume it, and this is something we're going to keep maintaining every year. All of the core of this is really looking at where should you be planning to be able to expand and optimize your operations as you look into 2023 planning. Where do you need to plan for either capacity, plan for skills, or plan for where you need to expand your services? In fact, we have service providers that use it just for that. Where do they need to deploy? Well, enterprises are looking at how am I going to optimize the skills for the different industries that we see hubs forming around. And technology partners are looking at where do we have to enable capacity to be able to meet the demand that's being forecast. So all this data is available because it's fundamental to ensuring that we continue to enable this fundamental tool that's helping the global economy grow.
Fascinating. So you talked about metros a little bit. Do you have any more information, any more data on metros?
So everything we've talked about so far has been sort of the high level forecast, but we get pretty deep. So in every one of the regions, we've broken down our data down into what are we able to see as the growth rate of each individual metro. So if we look into that data a little bit, we start off with analysis per region of how quickly are the core locations growing versus the edge. And you'll see just here in the Americas, you can see the edge is growing at 44% CAGR while the core is at 38. We have a significantly faster growth rate at the edge, while that mix is dominant in the core. But when we go into the actual data, we can now get some really interesting insights. In every single location, we not only give the growth rate year over year of where interconnection is going, but we look at what is the mix of interconnection. For every single metro, what percent of that interconnection was being driven by network, hyperscale, financial services, enterprise, content digital media, or cloud and IT. So that vertical mix forecast by 2025 is really letting us understand how is that split being managed across all of those metros. But at the very bottom, there's something special we've brought in here. And we've been doing this for just the last couple of years. And we take our benchmark data, which we've looked at a group of leaders that are about 600 different leaders. And we've analyzed that group to understand who are they connecting to. Because not only do I want to know how quickly they're growing, not only do I want to know who's connecting, but I want to know who they're connecting to. To get insight into that, we brought in this analysis from the leaders to understand what percent of their interconnections were to different classes, what percent are to network providers, to the cloud providers, or to business partners. And you can just see directly from the data how insightful that can be. Let's look at how New York is being leveraged. That is driven heavily by financial services, but who are they connecting to? And surprisingly, it's not the cloud providers. They are leveraging significant amounts of B2B access as they require all of those partners to help drive the electronic trading and financial ecosystems that are local to New York. You come over to Washington, D.C., and it's an entirely different mix. You can see the dependency and the access to clouds is a much stronger portion as they're leveraging the bandwidth and the cloud partners as well as direct peering. And so using this, you can get not only a sense of the growth rate, the total amount of bandwidth, the profile of who's requesting it, but what those end destinations are. And you can have that across core, edge, and across all the regions for up to 38 different metros. So you're going to see that across our edge locations, breaking down each one of the different areas. And you're going to see that then coming across regions as we bring that analysis for what is EMEA and what is APAC doing. And then all of the raw data that's here for either our forecast or our benchmark is all detailed down into the actual appendix, where we break down what is the actual profile for growth in each one of the areas. And out of that benchmark data, you're going to see this incredible analysis where we've taken for out of our leader benchmark, what is the average profile for these top fast-moving leaders across each one of the industries? How many metros are they deploying at core locations? How many are they deploying across edge locations? What are the top metros globally? And then we break that down by region. So this is a great heat map to tell you where you need to be, where the hot metros are, where is the growth rate. And if you wanted to benchmark your infrastructure against what the leaders are doing, you've got the data right here.
Fascinating. I mean, I can even imagine for like the telecom providers, you know, the Verizons, the AT&Ts of the world, they can leverage this data to figure out where they need to deploy that 5G capability, that 5G capacity, because this is where the growth is happening. And as a result, these folks are going to need access to that kind of that last line that we talked about. This is just a ton of information. What else you got for me?
And especially as you start to see organizations start to blend into adjacent markets, because this is one of the powers of becoming a digital provider. All of these organizations, as they grow to digital, we're starting to see them move into adjacent markets. And so as you're trying to expand into a adjacent area, you're moving from manufacturing and becoming specialty in healthcare, a specialty in wholesale, a specialty in business professional services. You can start to look at what does that market look like as you move from your traditional industry out to becoming a true digital provider. This data can really help you profile where you need to be at. So, Elias, I'm hoping this data can really help your a lot of your viewers understand and see and really help plan as they're driving their own business cases, as they prioritize what are those critical digital initiatives that are going to help them become more efficient, drive more innovation today, and really drive their market access. Where do they need to be, and what are the markets they want to capture? And this data, we hope, will be able to really help fuel their analysis and drive those capabilities.
That's fascinating. So, Jed, out of curiosity, how much effort does it take to produce this? Like, how many people are involved? How long does it take to crunch these numbers? There's a
it's a long process. I'll tell you, it's amazing how it goes through the pipeline. But we start this process actually at the start of every year. So Q1 of every single year is when we start the collection of the data between building our forecast, and that really starts heavily in Q2 of each year, looking through the cohort, and then bringing it through to where we're able to bring that out into publication. So the data you're seeing here is actually based on the first 6 months of analysis, captured, brought together, averaged out, built both our forecast and our benchmark, and is then really intended to be used through all of next year, which is why you'll see this called out as the GXI 2023, because this is really here to help inform your business decisions through 2023.
Dude, I thought Equinix was just a colo company. I mean,
when I first joined here, I had the similar perspective. It is amazing how such a foundational tool is able to be leveraged across so many areas. And Equinix is really all about the services and capability and how can you accelerate your growth where you need to be at so you can connect with more partners in more locations, and you can do it faster using the services you need. So because of our view, we have insight into the global consumption across all these areas that's really unmatched. And we want to share that data because this global analysis will lead you to how are you going to be able to consume that and participate that in the best way possible.
It's fascinating. And I know we scratched the surface. We barely scratched the surface of the type of data that's in there. I know you had a bunch of Excel spreadsheets and other things that you wanted to use to crunch numbers. But I think this was a really good introduction for our viewers to understand how to use this data, how to read this data, what types of insights you can grab from it. All of these things I think are important. Again, I'll reiterate, GXI report is free. I'll put some links in the description if you want to download a copy and take a look. Jed, do you interact directly with customers? How do customers interact around GXI? I'm curious, how does that work for you and Equinix?
Yeah, if anyone, as you're going through the GXI, if you're interested you can send a request out to the Equinix research group. If you're interested in a deeper follow-on to understand more about the data or there's other questions, happy to interact and to really start to look into. Many customers we work with are actually, the next step would be to take a strategy briefing, because this data is really just the first step. It's really looking at what are the locations? How is each organization going to build their own map? Where are the cloud adjacent locations they need to be in? Who are the partners they need to be able to connect with? What are the edge locations they have to deliver in? And today, what are the highest traffic locations that need to be optimized in order to be able to get the greatest efficiency? And so when you build that together and you look at that, that's really a next step. So we can use this data to help set up any transformation you're looking at, or many take that as their next logical step to understand where should they be and who do they need to connect with.
Fascinating. I know you and I can probably spend 2 or 3 more hours going through the data. We're both data geeks, and I enjoy when you take me through this data. There's just so much to learn, so much to get from an insights perspective.
Hopefully your viewers enjoy data as well, and I have not put them all to sleep, but there's so much that's in there. And again, if anyone has any questions through you or directly to Equinix Research Group, please ask, because we can definitely share more insights around this.
Yeah, and folks, if you enjoy this type of content, like I said, we could have taken this session and very easily expanded it. So drop me a note, leave a comment below. If you want to see more, we can bring Jed back. And I've seen some of his Excel spreadsheets and tools, and he can crunch numbers like I've never seen. There's really some fascinating stuff. So if this is interesting, let me know, and maybe we can potentially do a part 2 of this where we go deeper in the numbers and we have Jed show us some of the behind the scenes of how he calculates these numbers and how to further use them. So let me know about that as well. Jed, it's always fun to chat and interact with you. Thank you so much for spending time, for sharing your insights, for sharing the data, for explaining a little more about GXI. We're going to have to do this again pretty soon.
It'd be great, and thank you for bringing us on, and just let me take so much time to walk through what many people glaze over, which is the data itself, which I think is a really exciting piece to explore.
I agree. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you, Elias.